At 10 a.m. on the morning of October 11, 1943, Colonel Neel Kearby sat in the cockpit of a P-47 Thunderbolt 20,000 feet above the steaming jungles of New Guinea. He was sweating. The cockpit of the Thunderbolt was not designed for the tropics. It was a greenhouse, a glass bubble that trapped the relentless Pacific sun and cooked the pilot alive. But Kearby wasn't sweating because of the heat. He was sweating because he was staring at a formation of Japanese fighters that defied the laws of physics. Below him, over the Japanese stronghold of Wewak, a swarm of Mitsubishi Zeros and Kawasaki Tonys were climbing to meet him. They looked like white paper kites floating on an updraft. They moved with a terrifying, weightless grace. When they turned, they snapped around in the air as if they were on rails. Kearby looked at his own wings. They were thick, heavy slabs of metal loaded with .50 caliber machine guns. His plane, nicknamed Fiery Ginger, weighed nearly 14,000 pounds. Fully loaded, it was a monster. It was the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter ever built by human hands. And right now, watching the Japanese fighters spiral up toward him, Kearby felt every single pound of that weight. To understand the sheer insanity of this matchup, you have to look at the numbers. The Japanese Zero weighed about 5,000 pounds. It was built out of a special super-light aluminum alloy. It had no armor plating to protect the pilot. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. It was basically a flying gas can with a seat strapped to it. Because it was so light, it could dance. It could turn inside the radius of a dime. It could climb like a helium balloon. It was a sword fighter, elegant and deadly. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not a sword. It was a brick wrapped in aluminum. It was designed by a man named Alexander Kartveli who believed that the solution to every problem was more armor, more guns, more engine. The pilots didn't climb into the P-47. They climbed onto it. It stood so tall on its landing gear that the mechanics had to stand on ladders just to fuel it. The fuselage was so wide that a small man could curl up inside the ductwork. When it taxied, it didn't bounce. Crushed the ground. If a Zero was a samurai, the P-47 was a drunken brawler swinging a sledgehammer. This weight was a death sentence in the Pacific. In 1943, the rules of air combat were simple: turn and burn. The pilot who could turn the tightest won the fight. If a Japanese pilot got on your tail, you had to turn hard to shake him. But if you tried to turn a 7-ton P-47 against a Zero, you died. The laws of inertia would take over. The heavy American plane would slide through the air, groaning and shuddering, while the lightweight Zero cut across the circle and put 20mm cannon shells right into the cockpit. The experts knew this. The generals in Washington knew this. When the P-47 first arrived in the Pacific, the other pilots laughed until their sides hurt. The P-38 pilots, flying their sleek twin-engine Lightnings, called the Thunderbolt the flying bathtub. They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, because it looked like a milk bottle turned on its side. The British pilots were even cruder. They joked that the pilot could unstrap himself and run around the cockpit to dodge bullets because it was so big. They said that if you were attacked, the best defensive maneuver was to unbuckle your harness and run to the tail. The mockery wasn't just friendly ribbing. It was based on fear. The pilots looked at the short, muddy runways of New Guinea and looked at the massive bulk of the Jug and did the math. They knew that if the engine quit on takeoff, the plane wouldn't glide. It would drop like a grand piano. They knew that if they got into a low-speed dogfight, they were flying a coffin. The commanding officers tried to boost morale. They talked about the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. They talked about the turbo supercharger that gave it high-altitude performance, but the pilots just looked at the Japanese Zeros doing loops around them and shook their heads. The biggest problem wasn't just the weight, it was the heat. The R2800 double Wasp engine was a masterpiece of American engineering. It had 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, creating a massive wall of power at the front of the plane. It was rated for 2,000 horsepower. That sounded like a lot, and it was, but pushing 7 tons of metal through the air required every single one of those horses. And in the humid, suffocating air of the Pacific, the engine was always on the verge of heat stroke. Heat is the enemy of all engines. When you compress air and fuel in a cylinder and ignite it, you get power, but you also get heat. If you try to squeeze more power out of the engine by cramming in more air and increasing the manifold pressure, the heat spikes. If the cylinder heads get too hot, the metal starts to soften. The pistons can melt. The fuel can detonate early, causing knock that sounds like a hammer hitting the engine block. If that happens, the engine doesn't just stop, it explodes. It tears itself apart, sending shrapnel through the cowling and oil over the windshield. Because of this, the generals and engineers put a strict red line on the throttle. The pilots were told, in no uncertain terms, that 2,000 horsepower was the limit. You could push the throttle to the wall for a few minutes military power, but you dared not go further. The manifold pressure gauge had a red mark at 52 inches of mercury. If you went past that red line, you were voiding the warranty and risking a court-martial. You were turning your engine into a grenade. This restriction drove the pilots crazy. They knew the engine had more to give. They could feel the beast wanting to run, but they were held back by the temperature gauge. It was like driving a race car with a governor on the engine. They would be in a climb, watching a zero pull away from them, and they would jam the throttle forward, begging for more power. But the needles would hit the red line, the cylinder head temperatures would spike toward the danger zone, and they would have to back off. They had to watch helplessly as the enemy climbed away into the sun to set up a kill. Neel Kearby wasn't the kind of man who accepted limits. He was a Texas boy, aggressive and stubborn. He loved the P-47 because he understood what it was. It wasn't a dogfighter. It was an energy fighter. It was designed to dive from high altitude, smash the enemy with one pass, and zoom back up. But to do that, you needed altitude. You needed to get above the zeros. And right now, staring at the climbing Japanese formation, Kearby knew he was losing the race. The zeros were climbing at a steep angle, their light airframes cutting through the thin air. Kearby's squadron was heavy with fuel and ammo. They were dragging. If the zeros got above them, the fight was over. The Japanese would dive on the heavy Thunderbolts, and there would be nothing the Americans could do but dive away and run for home. It was the same story every mission. The flying bathtub was too fat to climb and too hot to run. Kearby looked at his engine gauges. The cylinder head temperature was creeping up. The oil pressure was steady. The manifold pressure was sitting right on the limit. He was getting everything the manual said he could get. 2,000 horsepower. It wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed to break the rules. He needed to find a way to cool the fire inside the cylinders so he could cram more air in without melting the pistons. He needed a miracle, but all he had was a warning sticker on the dashboard that told him to stop. The zeros leveled off and turned toward him. They were confident. They had seen the big, clumsy American planes before. They knew they could outmaneuver them. They knew the Americans would be afraid to mix it up. They spread out, looking for the stragglers, getting ready to feast. Kearby tightened his grip on the stick. He looked at the forbidden range on his throttle quadrant. He knew that somewhere in a laboratory back in the States, engineers were working on a solution. They were experimenting with a secret mixture, a soup that could change everything. But right now, over the jungles of New Guinea, that solution felt a million miles away. He was just a man in a 7-ton anvil, waiting for the hammer to fall. While Colonel Kearby was sweating in his cockpit over New Guinea, a group of engineers back in the United States were sweating over drafting tables at the Republic Aviation factory. They knew the P-47 had a problem. It wasn't that the plane was bad. It was just too heavy for the engine to lift quickly. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 was a beast, but even a beast has limits. The problem was simple physics. To get more power, you have to burn more gas. To burn more gas, you have to shove more air into the cylinders. The P-47 had a massive turbo-supercharger in the tail that could compress the air until it was thick and dense. But compressing air makes it hot, really hot. When that superheated air hit the cylinders, it created a nightmare scenario called detonation. Imagine trying to light a firecracker in your hand, but instead of burning smoothly, it explodes all at once. That was what happened inside the engine. The fuel didn't burn evenly. It detonated like a bomb. The shock wave hammered the pistons so hard they cracked. It melted spark plugs. It turned a $50,000 engine into scrap metal in seconds. The engineers hit a brick wall. They couldn't add more pressure because the heat would kill the engine. They were stuck at 2,000 horsepower. Then one engineer remembered an old trick from the racing world. Evaporation. When water turns from liquid into gas, it absorbs a massive amount of heat. If you sprayed a fine mist of water directly into the engine's intake manifold along with the fuel and air, the water would flash evaporate instantly. It would rip the heat out of the air charge like a chemical ice pack. The cooling effect changed the math completely. Colder air is denser air. Denser air resists detonation. That meant you could force far more air into the cylinder without destroying the engine. It was like putting a fire extinguisher inside the combustion chamber. The fire burned harder, but the metal stayed intact. They realized they could push the engine from 2,000 horsepower to 2,300, even 2,800, simply by adding water. But pure water would freeze solid at altitude. They needed antifreeze. The answer was methanol. They mixed it 50-50 with water. The alcohol prevented freezing and added a small combustion boost. The system was called anti-detonant injection. Pilots called it water, juice, or soup. The engineers designed a retrofit quickly. A small tank behind the pilot's seat held the mixture. Lines ran to the carburetor. A simple solenoid valve controlled the flow. Push the throttle past the normal stop, hit the microswitch, and the mixture sprayed into the engine. Simple, elegant, dangerous. When Army Air Forces Command saw the data, they panicked. If the tank ran dry at full power, the cooling vanished instantly and the engine could destroy itself before the pilot could react. War emergency power stressed rods and crankshafts beyond design limits. Engines meant to last hundreds of hours could be ruined in minutes. Orders came down, use with extreme caution. Manuals were filled with red warnings. Mechanics safety wired the switch off. Pilots had to physically break the wire to engage it. It was a message. Do not touch unless you have no other choice. Then came another problem. The mixture was half alcohol. On remote Pacific bases, bored ground crews discovered they could filter it into drinkable moonshine. Guards were posted. Dye was added. The system gained a reputation as dangerous and undisciplined. High command hated it. Frontline pilots loved it. Loss rates were climbing. Japanese pilots learned to drag Thunderbolts into turning fights and kill them. Morale sagged. The P-47 was tough, but pilots felt shackled. Colonel Kearby knew all of this as the Japanese formation closed in. He knew breaking the wire meant paperwork, blame, maybe worse. He also knew that if he followed the rules, he might not survive the next minute. The Zero leader rolled his wing and dropped his fuel tank. Tracers began stitching the sky. Kearby looked at the throttle stop, the thin wire representing every regulation and warning label. He pushed forward. Resistance. Then the wire snapped. The throttle slammed into the war emergency range. Behind him, the valve opened. The pump whined. Water methanol surged into the induction system. The engine stumbled for a heartbeat, like choking on water. Then the chemistry worked. Heat vanished. Air density surged. The turbo screamed as oxygen flooded the cylinders. The Thunderbolt came alive. The manifold pressure gauge, which had been stuck at the red line of 52 inches, shot upward. It swept past 60, then 65, then 70. The effect on the aircraft was violent. It didn't accelerate like a car. It accelerated like it had been kicked in the tail by a giant. The 2,000 horsepower engine was suddenly producing 2,800 horsepower. It was an explosion of energy that the airframe wasn't designed to handle. The P-47 shuddered. The vibration traveled up through the floorboards and into Kearby's spine. It felt like the engine was trying to tear itself off the mounts. But it held. The propeller bit into the air with renewed fury, pulling the 7-ton beast forward. The Japanese pilot on Kearby's tail didn't understand what he was seeing. A second ago, the American plane had been a sluggish, heavy target wallowing in the air, trying to climb. The Zero was closing the distance easily, its pilot lining up the sights for a deflection shot. He expected the Thunderbolt to stall or dive. Instead, the American plane began to pull away. It defied the laws of momentum. It was gaining speed while climbing, something that shouldn't have been physically possible for a machine that heavy. The distance between the two planes stopped shrinking and started growing. The Zero pilot pushed his throttle to the maximum. but his lightweight engine had nothing left to give. He was watching a dump truck outrun a motorcycle. Kearby felt the G-forces pressing him into the seat. He watched the airspeed indicator climb past 250, then 300. He was vertical now, pointing the nose straight up into the sun. The water injection was keeping the cylinder head temperatures in the green even though the engine was producing enough power to light a small city. This was the energy-fighting doctrine the Americans had been trying to perfect. Until this moment, they had lacked the raw power to make it work against the agile Zeros. Now Kearby had energy to burn. He continued the climb until the Zero stalled out below him. The Japanese plane hung in the air for a moment, weightless, its nose dropping as gravity won the battle. That was the moment Kearby was waiting for. He kicked the rudder pedal over. The P-47 performed a hammerhead stall, pivoting on its wingtip like a heavy pendulum. The nose sliced down through the horizon. Now gravity was on Kearby's side. The massive weight of the Thunderbolt, which had been a liability on the way up, became a deadly advantage on the way down. Felt like a safe dropped from a building. Kearby lined up the Zero in his gun sight. The Japanese pilot was struggling to regain speed, desperate to turn and evade, but the P-47 was coming down at 400 miles per hour. The closure rate was terrifying. Kearby squeezed the trigger. The 8.50 caliber machine guns in the wings erupted. These weren't the polite machine guns of the early war. These were heavy shredders. They fired a wall of lead that converged at 300 yards. The stream of bullets caught the Zero at the wing root. There was no majestic dogfight. There was just physics. The heavy American bullets smashed through the thin aluminum skin of the Japanese fighter. They tore through the unarmored fuel tanks. The Zero didn't just catch fire. It disintegrated. The wings sheared off. The fuselage broke in half. It looked like someone had thrown a paper airplane into a wood chipper. Kearby pulled out of the dive, the G-forces graying out his vision, and rocketed back up toward the fight. Around him, the rest of his squadron had followed his lead. They saw their commander break the wire, and they did the same. Across the formation, pilots were smashing their throttles through the gate. The sky over New Guinea filled with the roar of engines running on soup. The battle, which had started with the Americans on the defensive, suddenly flipped. The Zeros, used to dictating the fight with their superior turning ability, found themselves in a nightmare. They couldn't catch the Americans in a climb. They couldn't catch them in a dive. And when the Americans turned to fight, they had so much speed they could slash through the Japanese formation and be gone before the Zeros could return fire. One American pilot, Lieutenant Dunham, found himself head-to-head with a Kawasaki Tony. The Tony was a sleek, liquid-cooled fighter, faster than the Zero. Usually, a head-on pass was a game of chicken. You flew straight at each other and saw who blinked first. But Dunham had the water injection engaged. He was closing at a combined speed of 600 miles per hour. He didn't blink. He unleashed a burst from his 8 guns. The recoil was so strong it actually slowed the plane by a few miles per hour. The sheer mass of lead hitting the Japanese plane stopped it cold. The Tony exploded into a cloud of debris. Dunham flew straight through the fireball, his windshield coated in oil and soot, his engine never missing a beat. The mechanics of the water injection system were holding up, but it was a delicate dance. The pilots had to watch their supply. The 15-gallon tank only lasted 5 to 10 minutes of continuous use. If it ran dry while the throttle was still wide open, the engine would detonate instantly. They had to use the power in bursts, engage the water, climb, kill, disengage. It was tactical resource management. At 400 miles per hour, they were managing cylinder temperatures while dodging 20mm cannon shells. The Japanese pilots were thrown into confusion. Their training manuals told them exactly what a P-47 could do. They knew its top speed. They knew its climb rate. But the planes they were fighting today were violating those numbers. It was as if the Americans had fielded a completely new aircraft overnight. The Zeros tried to use their agility, twisting and turning, trying to lure the Americans into a slow knife fight. But the American pilots refused to play. They used their new speed to boom and zoom. They would dive from above, blast a target, and use the momentum to shoot back up to safety. It was a vertical yo-yo of death the Japanese couldn't counter. Kirby spotted another target, a Zero trying to sneak up on his wingman. He rolled the Thunderbolt over and dove. The airspeed indicator flirted with the red line, 500 miles per hour. At this speed, the controls of the Zero stiffened, making it almost impossible to turn. The P-47, built like a tank, handled the speed with ease. Kirby adjusted his aim. He didn't need to get close. The kinetic energy of his plane was so high he closed the gap in seconds. He fired a short burst. The incendiary rounds walked across the Zero's cockpit. The canopy shattered. The plane rolled over and spiraled down into the jungle below. For 20 minutes, the sky over Wewak was a chaotic mix of smoke and tracers, but the outcome was becoming clear. The flying bathtubs were cleaning house. The Japanese formation was broken. The surviving Zeros, realizing they had lost the altitude and speed advantage, dove for the deck, trying to run for the protection of their anti-aircraft guns. The Americans, low on fuel and ammunition and with their water tanks running dry, broke off the engagement. Kirby throttled back. He moved the lever out of the war emergency range and back to normal cruise power. The water pump shut off. The manifold pressure dropped back to safe levels. The engine temperature, which had been hovering near the limit, began to cool. The vibrations smoothed out. The adrenaline that had sharpened his vision began to fade, replaced by the deep exhaustion that comes after combat. He looked around the sky. He counted the parachutes drifting down. He counted the burning wrecks in the jungle canopy. He checked his squadron. They were forming up on his wing. Their planes were scorched by gun gas and chipped by debris, but they were all there. The engines were still running. The pistons hadn't melted. The cylinders hadn't exploded. The suicide switch hadn't killed them. It had saved them. The engineers back at Republic had been right. The bootleg mixture of water and alcohol had tamed the heat. It had turned the lead sled into a rocket. As they turned south for the flight back to base, Kirby looked at the empty water injection light on his dashboard. He patted the side of the cockpit. The British could call it a bathtub all they wanted. The Japanese could call it a monster. But Kirby knew what it really was. It was a machine that could take a beating and dish out punishment on a scale that nothing else in the sky could match. The rules had been broken. The wire had been snapped, and the air war in the Pacific had just changed forever. The Japanese Empire had awakened a giant, and now that giant had figured out how to sprint. When Colonel Neel Kearby taxied his P-47 back to the hard stand at the airbase in Port Moresby, the ground crew was waiting. They saw the gun ports covered in soot. They saw the empty shell casings spilling out of the ejection chutes. They knew there had been a fight, but the crew chief was looking at something else. He climbed up on the wing and peered into the cockpit. He saw the safety wire on the water injection switch. It was snapped. The copper wire hung loose, twisting in the breeze. In the strict world of Army regulations, that broken wire was evidence of a crime. It meant the pilot had pushed the engine past the red line, past the warranty, and into the danger zone where metal turns to liquid. The mechanics approached the massive Pratt & Whitney engine with dread. They expected to smell burnt oil and melted aluminum. They expected to open the cowling and find a wreck with cracked cylinder heads and warped pistons. They brought their toolboxes, ready to spend the next 3 days swapping out a ruined engine. But when they pulled the panels off, they found a mystery. The engine wasn't melted. In fact, it looked better than it had before the mission. The water and alcohol mixture hadn't just cooled the combustion. It had steam-cleaned the inside of the cylinders. The carbon deposits that usually choked the valves were gone. The spark plugs were clean. The massive radial engine ticked over as it cooled, ticking like a clock that had just started running on time. The report that Kearby sent up the chain of command didn't result in a court-martial. It resulted in a revolution. The generals looked at the combat film. They saw the heavy lead sleds climbing vertically away from Zeros. They saw the Japanese fighters exploding under the hammer blows of the new American tactics. The evidence was undeniable. The forbidden switch wasn't a liability. It was the key to unlocking the true potential of the Thunderbolt. The orders changed almost overnight. The red warnings were peeled off the dashboards. The safety wires were removed. Water methanol injection became standard operating procedure. The war emergency power setting was no longer a desperate gamble. It was the standard way to fight. With the engine finally unleashed, the P-47 transformed from a defensive liability into the most terrifying predator in the Pacific. The pilots stopped fearing the Zero. They learned that, with the water injection engaged, they could dictate every second of the battle. If a Zero turned, they went vertical. If a Zero climbed, they used their massive power to run it down. The flying bathtub joke stopped. The British pilots who had laughed at the jug now watched in envy as the Americans roared past them at 450 miles per hour, carrying enough ammo to sink a destroyer. But the true legacy of the Thunderbolt wasn't just in air-to-air combat. Because the engine was now so powerful and so cool, the P-47 could carry a ridiculous amount of weight. The generals realized they didn't just have a fighter, they had a flying tank. They started strapping bombs under the wings, 500-pound bombs, then 1,000-pound bombs, then rockets. The P-47 became the premier ground attack aircraft of the war. It would dive on German tanks in Europe and Japanese bunkers in the Pacific, unleashing a storm of high explosives, and then use its massive radial engine to power its way back out of the flak. The ruggedness of the machine became legendary. The water-cooled engines of the P-51 Mustang or the Spitfire were fragile. One bullet in the radiator would drain the coolant, and the engine would seize up in minutes. But the P-47 was air-cooled. It didn't have a radiator. It didn't have liquid coolant lines to leak. You could shoot a cylinder head clean off a P-47 engine and the other 17 cylinders would keep pumping. Pilots came back with holes in their wings big enough to crawl through. They came back with half a tail. They came back with tree branches stuck in the air intakes from flying so low. The jug brought them home when anything else would have put them in the dirt. Colonel Kearby kept flying. He didn't retire to a desk job to teach the new tactics. He stayed in the cockpit. He racked up 22 confirmed kills, becoming one of the top aces of the Pacific theater. He fought with an aggression that bordered on recklessness, always pushing the throttle through the gate, always trusting the machine to hold together. But even the toughest machine has limits, and even the best luck runs dry. In March of 1944, over the same jungles of Wewak where he had first tested the water injection, Kearby was shot down. He had jumped 3 Japanese bombers but was caught by a sniper in a high-flying fighter. He didn't bail out. He rode his Thunderbolt into the jungle. He was found years later, still strapped into the cockpit of the plane that he had taught to sprint. The war moved on. The P-51 Mustang arrived and stole the glory. The Mustang was sleek, sexy, and had the range to fly all the way to Berlin and Tokyo. It was the sports car that ended up on all the posters. But the men who fought the dirty war, the war in the mud and the flak, knew the truth. The Mustang was a racehorse, but the Thunderbolt was a workhorse. The P-47 dropped more bombs than any other fighter. It destroyed more trains, more tanks, and more trucks than any other aircraft in history. It broke the back of the German army in France and the Japanese army in the Philippines. It did the heavy lifting while the other planes took the pictures. By the end of the war, the factory at Republic had built more than 15,000 Thunderbolts. They were flown by Americans, British, French, and Russians. They were flown by Brazilians in Italy and Mexicans in the Philippines. It was the most produced American fighter of the war. And yet, after the war ended, they disappeared quickly. The jet age arrived, and the massive piston engine fighters were scrapped. They were melted down to make toaster ovens and cars. The Jug, the plane that had saved thousands of pilots' lives, was considered obsolete junk. But the lesson of the P-47 remains. It is a lesson about the difference between theory and reality. On paper, the Thunderbolt was too heavy. On paper, the engine was maxed out. On paper, the water injection was dangerous. But war isn't fought on paper. It is fought by men like Neel Kearby who look at a red line on a gauge and decide to cross it. It is fought by engineers who realize that sometimes the only way to fix a high-tech problem is with a bucket of water and some moonshine. The forbidden switch proved that rules are written for the average day, but survival requires the courage to break them. Today, there are only a handful of airworthy P-47s left in the world. When you see one at an air show, it looks impossibly big. It casts a shadow that swallows the smaller fighters parked next to it. When the engine starts, it doesn't whine like a jet. It barks. It shakes the ground. It smells of oil and high-octane gas. It is a dinosaur from an age of giants. But if you look closely at the cockpit on the left side of the throttle quadrant, you might see the ghost of a copper wire that was snapped by a desperate hand in 1943. We rescue these stories to ensure Colonel Neel Kearby and his flying bathtub don't disappear into silence. We tell them because we need to remember that innovation often looks like madness until it works. We tell them because the pilots who sat in that steam bath cockpit, sweating over the jungles of New Guinea, deserve to be more than just a footnote in a history book. They were the ones who turned a bathtub into a rocket and flew it straight into the heart of the enemy. If the story of bootleg horsepower moved you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps us fight the algorithm and keep these histories alive. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the machines that won the war. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We want to hear from the history buffs in the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and everywhere else. Tell us if you had a grandfather who worked on these radial engines. We'll see you in the next.